Hello there. It's another time for our lesson on the ecosystem for JS2. Now we are looking at relationships between organisms in the same habitat. Now moving along, at the end of this lesson, learners should be able to define and describe the ecosystem. They should be able to describe the feeding relationships in an ecosystem, especially food chains and food web. Learners should also be able to describe the non-feeding relationships in an ecosystem. We are talking about associations. Now, moving along, we'll be looking at the ecosystem. What is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is made up of all the living and non-living things that interact in an area. Now, these interactions between living and non-living things are either feeding or non-feeding interactions. So we'll be looking at it in details. Now, what are the feeding relationships or feeding interactions in the ecosystem? Now, the feeding interaction in an ecosystem is described using the food chain. Now, food chain and food web describes the feeding interactions in an ecosystem. Looking at it specifically, food chain, shows the linear feeding relationships between living organisms in an ecosystem. Yes, it's a linear relationship. Now, the food chain and the food web describe how energy and nutrients are taken in and used up in the ecosystem. Now, this is an example of a food chain. You can see it's a linear relationship, which describes how energy passes from one living organism to another. And in every food chain, we start with a producer. And the producers are also called autotrophs. They produce their own food by themselves using the energy from the sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to produce their own food. Now, grass, all green plants fall under producer. Now, the food chain is also made up of consumers. And in this case, we have three types of consumers. We have the primary consumer, we have the secondary consumer, and tertiary consumer. The primary consumer feeds directly on grass. They are called herbivores. Now, the secondary consumer that feeds directly on primary consumer are called carnivores. They feed on flesh. Carnivores are animals that feed on flesh. Now, we have another type of consumer called the omnivore. The omnivore feeds on both the grass and flesh. Yes, omnivores feed on both grass and flesh. And altogether, the consumers are also called heterotrophs. Why? Because they depend on other organisms for food. In this food chain, we have grasshopper, which is the primary consumer, bluebird, which is the secondary consumer, and snake, which is the tertiary consumer. We also have another type of consumer called the quaternary consumer, which in this case is the owl. And lastly, the food chain is made up of what we call the decomposers. The decomposers are the bacteria and fungi that help to break down dead organic matter. Now, when all these consumers, when they die, they are broken down by the decomposers and they turn them into nutrients that goes into the soil, which the producer uses to grow. So you can see now that is a food chain. The cycle is complete. And with the aid of the decomposers, the cycle is complete. Now, what does this arrow in a food chain signify? The arrow in the food chain signifies the energy flow from one organism to another. So it's telling us that energy flows from the grass to the grasshopper, and this arrow shows that energy flows from the grasshopper to the bluebird, and the bluebird, the energy flows to the snake, and so on and so forth. Now, moving along, we are looking at the food web. This is an example of a food web. Now, a food web is a combination of many interlinking food chains. A food web consists of all the food chains in a single ecosystem. Now, as you can see in this particular food web, we have various types, many food chains coming together, interlinking one another. As you can see, how many food chains can you get from this food web? I want to pause the video and make a count and guess how many food chains are present in this food web. Now, moving along, we are going to be looking at the non-feeding interactions in the ecosystem. Now there are basically 4 non-feeding interactions in an ecosystem. We have the mutualism, we have parasitism, commensalism. Now these three non-feeding relationships that I just mentioned are classified under what we call symbiosis. They are classified what we call symbiosis. Now symbiosis is the relationship between two different species of organisms in which one or both of them benefit. So we are going to be looking at the various types of symbiosis. Then afterwards, the last one in the last interaction here is competition. Now looking at the various types of symbiosis that we have, mutualism is the relationship between two species of organism in which both of them, that means both of the organisms benefit, so they benefit from the interaction. Commensalism is the relationship between two organisms, two different species of organisms, in which one organism benefits and the other organism is unaffected. In other words, the organism neither benefits nor is harmed by the interaction. Now parasitism is another type of symbiosis, which is the relationship between two different species of organism where one benefits and the other organism is harmed. One benefits and the other organism is harmed. The organism that benefits is called the parasite, while the organism that is harmed is called the host. Now sometimes this is a feeding relation. Now let's look at the examples that we have here, examples of non-feeding relationships. Now I told you before that symbiosis is a kind of relationship between two different species of organism. Now an example of mutualism here is the bacteria which lives in the gut of human beings. Now these bacteria help to break down certain type of food in the intestine, which provides food for the bacteria itself and which helps human beings digest that type of food. So it's a win-win, it's a beneficial relationship for both organisms. Human beings benefit by having that type of food broken down, while the bacteria, gets food from that relationship. Now another example of commensalism is the cattle egret and the cattle. Now as the cattle moves on the grass, the cattle stirs up insects which the egret actually eats up. Now in this case, the egret is the only one that benefits in this relationship, while the cattle is unaffected in the relationship. Now in the case of parasitism, an example is the ticks and dogs. Now tick is found on the body of the dog. The tick here is called an ectoparasite. An ectoparasite is a parasite found outside the body, while the endoparasite is found inside the body. But in this example, the tick is found on the skin of the dog. Now the tick gets nourishment from the dog and the dog is harmed in the process. The tick can bring about disease for the dog or discomfort for the dog one way or the other. So the dog will have to scratch its skin because of the discomfort. So this is an example of a parasitic relationship. Now finally, we'll be looking at competition. What is competition? Now all living things need natural resources, but the problem is that there is not enough for everyone. So this means that individuals have to fight for these resources in order to survive, and this struggle leads to what we call competition. Now living organisms may have to compete for food, they may have to compete for water, they may have to compete for space, they may also have to compete for mates. You can see two lions may be fighting over one female lion, while predators may be fighting for one prey, while in this case monkey and chimpanzee may be fighting for food. So this is a typical example of competition. Now this brings us to the end of our lesson for today. Now we'll be looking at the summary. An ecosystem is made up of all the living and non-living things that interact in an area. These interactions are either feeding or non-feeding interaction. Food chain and food web describe the feeding interactions in an ecosystem. And lastly, there are basically 4 non-feeding interactions in an ecosystem. These are mutualism, parasitism, commensalism, and competition. Now I want you to go through this assessment and pause the video and answer the question and see how much of the lesson that you have actually imbibed or learned, and I'll see you again in the next lesson. Bye bye.